participating delegation, Qatar, to address the court and call upon His Excellency Mutlaq Al-Qahtani to take the floor.
Mr. President, members of the court, it's a great honor to appear before you as the representative of the State of Qatar in these historic proceedings. Qatar believes firmly that it's only through full respect for international law that peace and justice can be achieved. Recent events have underscored that international legal order is under threat. Unprecedented violence, hatred, cruelty, risk undoing decades of progress in the field of human rights, humanitarian law, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. Indeed, there is growing perception in some quarters of the that international law applies to some, but not to others. That some people are seen as deserving of security, freedom, and self-determination, but others are not. Some children are deemed worthy of the law's protection, but others are killed in their thousands. Qatar rejects such double standards. International law must be upheld in all circumstances. It must be applied equally to all, and there must be accountability for all violations. Yet, more than 75 years, the life of the Palestinian people has been treated as an exception to the international rule of law. Mr. President, members of the court, you have the clear mandate and indeed the responsibility to remedy this unacceptable situation. The credibility of the international legal order depends on your opinion, and the stakes cannot be higher. Indeed, Israel's genocidal war on the people of Gaza has shown that the situation in Palestine is the most pressing threat to international peace and security. As Secretary General Guterres emphasized, recent events did not occur in a vacuum. Rather, they grew out of Israel's illegal 57-year occupation of the Palestinian territories. Israel has denied the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. It has ethnically cleansed and colonized Palestinians' lands. Furthermore, it has implemented an apartheid regime, that's to say, a regime of systematic racial oppression and discrimination established with the intent to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. To maintain that regime, it has killed, maimed, and imprisoned tens of thousands of men, women, and children. These are the root causes of the situation we face today. These same causes are the subject of the General Assembly's request for advisory opinion. 20 years after its historic wall opinion, the court now has the entire question of Palestine squarely before it. The General Assembly did not mince its words when it posed two clear and complementary questions. Question A calls upon the court to assess the legality of Israel's individual policies and practices in its occupation of the Palestinian territories, which I will refer to as the OPT. Question A further calls upon the court to state the corresponding legal consequences of each of these policies and the practices. Question B, in turn, asks the court to answer a simple but historic questions in light of numerous illegalities in the conduct of the occupation. Has the occupation itself become illegal? If the answer to that question is yes, which is Qatar's submission, then the consequence is obvious. The occupation must be brought to an end. Mr. President, members of the court, Qatar's intervention will cover three topics. First, I will briefly explain why the court should give the advisory opinion requested by the General Assembly. Second, with reference to question A, I will recall Israel's main illegal policies and the practices in the OBT and explain that they are not isolated or accidental, but they are part of Israel's longest-standing settler colonial project in Palestine. Third, and finally, I will set forth Qatar's position on question B concerning the legal status of the occupation. I turn now to my first topic, propriety of the court rendering the advisory opinion. Mr. President, I need not to repeat what you have already heard from numerous participants this week. The court unequivocally has jurisdiction, and there is no compelling reason for it to refuse to give its opinion. In particular, the court's opinion would not underestimate or undermine the possibility of a negotiated solution to the conflict. Qatar explained why, in its written comments, the so-called peace process is dead. To provide the court with relevant historical context, Qatar engaged two most prominent historians of the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts alive today. One Palestinian, Professor Rashid Khalidi of Columbia University, and one Israeli, Professor Efli Shalim of Oxford University. Professor Khalidi and Shalim prepared two comprehensive reports covering a century of histories from 1917 to 2023. You can find those reports at tabs 2 and 2 of your folders. Professor Shalim's report is devoted to the history and diplomacy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from 1967 and to today. He explains how, during this time, Israel has consistently obstructed a negotiated solution. Rather than pursuing a genuine peace, Israel used the so-called peace as a diplomatic cover for its colonization of Palestine. In this context, it's difficult to see what harm the court's advisory opinion could possibly have on a non-existent peace process. On the contrary, the absence of a viable peace process only underscores the necessities of the court's advisory opinion and a solution based on international law. I turn now to my second topic, concerning question A and Israel's illegal policies and practices of the OBT. Mr. President, members of the court, Israel's illegal and discriminatory policies and practices are the tools of long-standing settler colonial project. As Qatar explained in its written statement, these policies are designed to promote a single goal: the permanent colonization of the OBT for the exclusive benefit of Israel and the Jewish Israeli settlers. This goal is essentially linked to Israel's oppressive and discriminatory practices in the OBT and is the root cause of the cycles of violence there. In Chapter 2 of its written statement, Qatar described in detail the 8 main categories of discriminatory policies and practices that Israel employs in furtherance of its settler colonial project. In Chapter 3 of its written statement, Qatar explained that these policies and practices entail a flagrant violation of international law, human rights law, and constitutes a crime against humanity, war crimes, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. It is Qatar's position that in order to fully respond to question A, the court should assess the legality of each of Israel's main policies and practices through these lenses. A fulsome response to question A is no less than a clear answer to question B. The court should not underestimate that the impact that finding of fact and law will have in bringing Israel's specific policies and practices to an end, to encouraging accountability, and to provide victims with a sense of justice. In the limited time I have today, I will briefly call some specific points about the 8 main categories of policies and practices carried out by Israel in the OBT. The first central features of Israel's settlers' colonial projects is, of course, settlement. The establishment and development of Jewish Israeli settlements in the OPT began immediately after Israel occupied it in 1967. Israel establishes Jewish Israeli settlements on seized Palestinian land, finances and facilitates the construction of housing and infrastructures, and incentivizes Jews from around the world to settle there. By 2023, over 700,000 settlers, or approximately 11% of Jewish Israelis, were living in the OPT. The settlement's activities is relentless. In a January 2024 report, which you can find at tab 3 of your folders, the Israeli human rights group Peace Now explained how the war in Gaza has been exploited as cover for unprecedented surge in settlement activities. The same is happening in East Jerusalem, and even Gaza is now at risk. The Israeli security ministers recently stated that, quote, "Not only do I not rule out Jewish settlement in Gaza, I believe it is also an important thing," end quote. On January 28, 2024, a conference dedicated to the resettlement of Gaza was held in occupied Jerusalem, which was attended by 12 Israeli government ministers. Mr. President, members of the court, let me pause here to make a brief remark about the situation in Gaza as it relates to the advisory proceedings. The contentious proceedings instituted by South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention do not mean that the recent situation in Gaza should not be addressed here. Gaza is part of the OPT. It was occupied before October 7, and it is occupied today. Israel's policies and practices referred to in question A includes its policies and practices in Gaza. The court will examine the situation in Gaza through the lens of the Genocide Convention in the case brought by South Africa. Here the court can, and indeed must, apply all aspects of international law to the situation in Gaza, including well before October 7. This brings me to Israel's second central policy and practice in the OPT, which is displacement. In order to establish its settlements in the OPT, Israel seizes public and private land and forcibly displaces Palestinians. It does so through home demolitions, evictions, building restrictions, and by establishing buffer or military zones. Again, the situation has only grown worse since October 7. As is well established, Israel has forcibly displaced at least 75% of the population in Gaza. This policy is promoted by Israeli leaders as a solution to their Palestinian demographic problem. Israeli Minister of Culture stated that the Palestinians, quote, "can go to island or to the desert. The masters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves," end quote. While all eyes may be on Gaza, the situation in the West Bank is rapidly deteriorating. At least 13 different communities in the West Bank have faced forced displacement since October 7. That has resulted in the north-south stretch of 20 kilometers east of Ramallah being cleared of nearly all Palestinians. The third Israeli practice is fragmentation. In order to implement the demographic and physical control necessary to perpetuate the occupation and establish further settlements, Israel divides and isolates Palestinians. It relegates them to fragmented enclaves, restricts their movement, and renders their daily lives all but unlivable. This is what Namibia and Belize aptly referred as strategic fragmentation. Israel has imposed a full blockade on Gaza since 2007, entirely cutting its population off from the rest of the world. October 7, Gaza had already been described by the UN Secretary General as hell on earth. Today, it is indescribable. In the West Bank, Israel has, for decades, implemented a system of draconian checkpoints, subjecting millions of Palestinians to daily indignities. Human Rights Watch has documented, quote, more than 40 kilometers of West Bank roads that authorities prohibit Palestinians from traveling on, end quote. Since October 7, Israel has implemented unprecedented lockdown on the entire civilian territory of the West Bank. It has closed much of its vast network of checkpoints, completely cutting off cities, towns, and villages from each other. The fourth practice that characterizes Israel occupation is its discriminatory and unlawful violence. Israeli forces and Jewish Israeli settlers, often with the support of the state, use violence to crush even non-violent resistance to the occupation and to perpetuate a climate of fear and repression. Israeli violence has been part of the fabric of life for Palestinians even before the beginning of the occupation in 1967, and Gaza has always paid the highest price. In the 15 years before October 7, Israeli military campaigns killed 5,365 Palestinians in Gaza, the majority of whom were indisputably civilians. Of course, this is shocking statistics pales in comparison to what we have in the past 4 months. At the same time, the court cannot ignore the ever-worsening situation in the West Bank. Since October 7, 397 Palestinians have been killed across the West Bank, and 453 have been injured. Even before October 7, 234 Palestinians were killed in 2024, which was the highest number on record. Civilian casualties are not just collateral damage in Israeli attacks. They are the main target. The use of warplanes, armed drones, attack helicopters, and missiles was once unprecedented in the West Bank. Now it is routine. Mr. President, members of the court, Israel's victims are often children. They include 5-year-old Ruqayya, who was shot in the back by Israeli forces on January 7th at a military checkpoint in the West Bank. Her body was withheld from her family by Israeli forces for 10 days. Just last week, Israeli forces also shot 16-year-old Nahil in the head, killing him as he was leaving school. Nahil was the 100th Palestinian child killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank since October 7. This brings me to the fifth practice implemented by Israel, which is its discriminatory military legal system in the OBT. This system privileges Jewish Israeli settlers while depriving Palestinians of the most basic legal protections. A pillar of this system is the practice of indefinite administrative detention of Palestinians without charges. As we detailed in our written statement, this practice was widespread before October 7. Its use has increased excessively since then, in what some rights groups have characterized as mass enforced disappearances. In the past 4 months alone, thousands of Palestinians have been placed in administrative detentions. In Gaza, they are rounded up, blindfolded, disrobed, humiliated, and detained in makeshift outdoor prisons. You can find detailed reporting at tabs 5 and 6 of your folders. In the interest of time, I will not detail the 3 remaining policies and the practices that characterize Israel's occupation, which are discussed in Chapter 2 of Qatar's written statement. These practices are 6: the eradication and suppression of all manifestations of Palestinians' culture and religion in the OBT. 7th, the economic oppression of Palestinians and the exploitations of the OBT's natural resources. And 8, the systematic persecution and suppression of all those who attempt to document or pursue accountability for the occupation, such as human rights organizations and journalists. This includes Al Jazeera, Shireen Abu Akleh, who was murdered by Israeli forces on May 11, 2022. Mr. President, members of the court, these 8 discriminatory practices and policies are among those that the court is called upon to assess in answering question A. Viewed jointly, they reveal the true nature of the occupation as an illegal settler colonial regime. I will turn now to the final portion of Qatar's presentations concerning the legal status of the occupation and the response to question B. Mr. President, members of the court, the written statements and comments that addressed in question B overwhelmingly endorsed a finding by the court that the Israeli occupation of the OPT is illegal. This was the express conclusion of at least 38 participants in these proceedings, with at most 2 states reaching the opposite conclusion. Those participants finding that the occupation is illegal offered a number of lines of analysis to support their shared conclusion. This is unsurprising. Israel's occupations has violated so many fundamental principles of international law that it would be hard to point to just one reason for its illegality. In Chapter 3 of Qatar's written comments, we identified 5 main reasons as to why Israel's occupations of the OPT is illegal. With its written comments, Qatar also submitted a detailed appendix compiling relevant statements by participating states and organizations. These can be found at tabs 7 to 15 of your folders. We hope that Qatar's analysis will be helpful for the court's work. I shall briefly walk the court through 5 reasons for the illegality of the occupation. First, the occupation contravenes the jus cogens obligation to respect the right of self-determination of the Palestinian people. 39 states and international organizations found that the occupation violates the right of self-determination. 28 of those participants underscored that the occupation has become illegal for this reason. Second, Israel's occupation also violates jus cogens prohibition of apartheid. 25 participants endorsed a finding of apartheid. Among those reaching this conclusion, 16 participants underscored that the situation of apartheid renders the occupation itself illegal. Third, Israel's occupation is illegal because it violates jus cogens prohibition on the use of force. This was the conclusion of 18 participants. Fourth, by virtue of its illegal annexation of portion of OPT, Israel has breached yet another jus cogens norm, the prohibition on the acquisition of territory through the use of force. At least 41 participants in the proceedings have pointed this out, with 31 of them underscoring that the occupation is illegal as a whole because Israel's annexation of the OPT is an integral feature of the occupation. Fifth and finally, Israel's occupation is illegal due to the fact that it's not of a temporary character, not being carried out in good faith, or not being administered in the best interest of the occupied population. 17 states reach such conclusions. Mr. President, members of the court, the state of Qatar endorses all of these arguments for the illegality of the occupation. While it's, of course, for the court to decide how best to answer the General Assembly's questions B, it is Qatar's respectful submission that the court should not limit itself to choosing only one of these grounds for illegality. Unlike contentious cases, judicial economy does not support the adoption of only the narrowest reasoning possible in these proceedings. To the contrary, in the context of an advisory opinion, the court's function is to provide legal advice to the organ requesting the opinion. There are multiple relevant legal regimes applicable to the situation, and the court's advice on each of these frameworks will be of immense value to the General Assembly and to the international community at large. In this connection, Qatar and many other states attach particular importance to a finding that Israel's occupation by its nature amounts to a regime of apartheid. A finding of apartheid is not just the most accurate label for what the occupation has become. It also provides a tangible but a flexible roadmap for what must come next. What ending apartheid requires is achieving a situation in which all people, Israeli and Palestinians, equally enjoy their fundamental human rights and dignity. With the requisite finding of apartheid by the court, the international community, including the General Assembly, can activate similar mechanism for bringing about an end of the occupation as it did with the apartheid regime in South Africa. This is the surest path to truth, justice, and yes, reconciliation. Mr. President, members of the court, the people of the world are looking at you. We are confident that you will seize this historic opportunity to finally bring to an end a century of injustice against the Palestinian people. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the delegation of Qatar for its presentation, which brings to a close this morning's hearing. The court will meet again this afternoon at 3 p.m. to hear the United Kingdom, Slovenia, Sudan, Switzerland, the Syrian Arab Republic, and Tunisia. The sitting is adjourned.